screencast is to append the trip to the National Gallery, give some background and collateral information to go with the works that we looked at down at the NGA on the 7th. Remember, we were talking down there how Titian's work for Duke Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara had begun to introduce him to Northern Italian court society. It was really a very important series of paintings Titian had done, in that it established him at court and really ended up helping with a significant part of the rest of his career. Alfonso d'Este's works came to the attention of the Duke of Mantua, Federico Gonzaga, which is right nearby Ferrara, where Titian was painting for the Este family. So again, one court commission led to other court commissions. Gonzaga then introduced Titian to his brother-in-law, the Duke of Urbino, who we see over here, Francesco Maria della Rovere of Urbino. And it is for the Urbino dukes, the della Roveres of Urbino, that Titian paints one of his more famous works, the Venus of Urbino, a nickname that has been given to it. This was commissioned for Francesco Maria's son, Guidobaldo della Rovere. And it's been suggested that perhaps the picture was painted for Guidobaldo's wedding. A couple of details suggest this. The dog, for example, is a standard symbol of marital fidelity. We see it all the time in Renaissance pictures. But also in the background here, we have a myrtle plant, M-Y-R-T-L-E, a myrtle plant in a pot. And myrtles, because they live for a very, very long time, are also seen as symbols of marriage and fidelity. Furthermore, Venus has two servants here in the background, and you can see them rummaging around in a decorated chest. This is a wedding chest called a cassone, C-A-S-S-O-N-E, and that also gives rise to the idea that this might have been painted for a wedding chest, or for a wedding itself, for Guidobaldo's wedding. There's a couple of problems with this, however. First, the dog is asleep, so the sign of fidelity may be fidelity having taken a little nap. But over and above that, Guidobaldo was married already back in 1534, too early for Titian to have painted this. So what seems much more likely is that the painting, rather than even showing Venus in the first place, is really just a simple piece of erotica, an erotic work of art that Guidobaldo kept on private view, showing to the select few who he wanted to share it with. And we should really look at it as nothing more than a work intended to arouse, painted by Titian to arouse the senses of his patron. Now, for this work, Titian went back to earlier works he had known very well. You can see that the pose is really a variation on this work by Giorgione, who was Titian's teacher. And in fact, this work was unfinished at Giorgione's death in 1510, and most scholars agree that Titian worked on it heavily, certainly the background and maybe even parts of the figure as well. Giorgione's figure is already eroticized. Now, whether or not she's Venus is also open to question, and neither of them has Cupid, which would lock down the identification. Both of them are really just sleeping women. So he's already generalized it into being a sleeping nude. And you'll notice that in both of them, the hand that covers her crotch is, in fact, has the fingers curled inward, which suggests a heightened sense of eroticism, that in fact she's perhaps even masturbating as she lays down. For Giorgione's picture, however, because she's asleep and because she's laying in nature, this allows her to be associated with other works that we've seen, where nude women are associated with the pleasures of landscape, the pleasures of nature, and are allegorical figures that inspire people around them. These are not without their own erotic content, as the gaze of the man on the left suggests. But Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, I think, fits in with these as a figure that is meant on a certain level to suggest the arousal of nature, the inspiration right away, Giorgione's picture did. This print, we haven't really talked a lot about printmaking apart from Mantegna, but this is an engraving by Domenico Campagnola, Venetian artist and painter, and again, sort of seems derived from Giorgione's prototype. She's not sleeping anymore, and she's not playing with herself anymore either. But she is, in fact, while awake, not quite yet making eye contact. Titian picks up on Giorgione's figure as well for one of his Este pictures, the pictures for the Count of the Duke of Ferrara, where, in this case, the sleeping figure in the lower right corner is homage to Giorgione's piece. The so-called Venus of Urbino is a conscious return to this tradition in the late 1530s after a spell of about 10 or 15 years or so. And what Titian does is to take the eroticism that Giorgione had established and ramp it up a notch, make it even more erotic. The fact that the servants in the back are either getting her clothes or putting them away suggests that she's supposed to be wearing clothes, and that makes her nakedness less natural. It makes it a little bit more naughty. So, too, does the contemporary interior versus the landscape setting. This enhances, again, the idea that she's not a woodland nymph or some sort of goddess, but rather is just in a contemporary interior. All of this enhances the eroticism, and also, of course, most importantly, is that she's making direct eye contact. She's aware of our viewership. She doesn't mind that we're there looking at her. And in fact, she's even holding the flowers that we've brought her. She sort of beats up that bouquet of flowers, mangles it with her fingers, just as her other hand is touching herself. Now, to enhance the idea that this was meant as an erotic work of art, at least to Guidobaldo della Rovere when he owned it, he kept it in the same room as this picture, image of Mary Magdalene by Titian, where here the biblical theme, Mary Magdalene in the desert with her ointment jar, naked, covered only by her hair, seems like just a mere excuse for an eroticized image. The only parts of her body that poke through her hair, other than her arms, of course, are her breasts. And while her pose is based on a modest Venus type, where she covers up her chest and her hips, of course, her hands are placed in a way so that they cover up absolutely nothing at all. So these works, by the way, there's various versions of this from Titian's hand, and I think more chaste owners might have wanted a simply more chaste image, although it's only some of her chaste. Her bodice has all but fallen off in this particular version of that Mary Magdalene. So these images that we're looking at really very much are part of a Venetian tradition of using sort of historicizing details as basically an excuse for an eroticized image. Giorgione's Laura, the laurel leaves suggest that she is Laura, the muse of Petrarch, the beloved of Petrarch, but really that's just only a partial excuse for the partially clothed woman with her nipple exposed underneath the fur of her robe. So these erotic images are really a strong part of Venetian art, and Titian's Venus of Urbino, again painted for the Duke of Urbino, Duke Guidobaldo of Urbino, is in fact part of that tradition. That work inspired quite a few others by Titian that focus on these erotic images of Venus. Some of them made more Venus, if you will, made more into, most specifically her, by the addition of Cupid. So you see many of the same details are here. She has the flowers in her hand, the puppy dog at her feet, which of course is now awake. There's also an angry cat under the table here as well. But he sort of made it safer in a way. She's no longer, her other hand is no longer in a compromising position. Cupid is there to make it all safe. In this particular one, the idea of the importance of the male gaze is emphasized as well. There's organ player, landscape out in the back to inspire him, and again, the angel with Venus inspiring him. So Titian's work really began, I think, began a period when Titian's doing quite a few of these images of eroticized images of naked women, and often veiled within the idea of a mythological scene, or even within a biblical scene. Another work that was inspired by the Venus of Urbino, it's also from the textbook, is this image of Danaia from the next decade, from the 1440s. Another mythological scene that is really the excuse for an eroticized image. This one was actually commissioned by a cardinal in Rome, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who had seen the Venus of Urbino and had asked Titian for a work of art. He didn't say what the subject was supposed to be, but he wanted a work of art more beautiful than the Venus. And in this case, he's certainly not talking about the painting as such, as much as he's talking about the subject matter. He wants a woman as beautiful as the Venus of Urbino, even more so than that. What's interesting about the picture is that through X-rays, it shows that when Titian started the work, he originally began it just as a female nude, with no sort of details to suggest any kind of mythology whatsoever. And then in the process of working, he adds the coins to tell the story of Danaia. Now, Danaia was one of the loves of Jupiter. Jupiter had a taste for humans, wanted to make love to many humans he was attracted to, and for each one of them, he finds out their weakness and uses that to seduce them. Danaia was vain. Danaia was captivated by material possessions. And so he appears to her in a shower of gold coins. And that's what we see here. This was not part of the original conception. This was something that Titian added to it. Again, it's this excuse for an eroticized female nude. The other details that we see, her jewelry, for example, add to the story. They help to characterize her as someone who is materialistic. We see on her ear as well, an earring. But also, at the same time, they suggest that maybe this woman should be wearing clothes. She's wearing her jewelry still, but has abandoned the rest of her clothes, and so that sort of heightens the erotic content of the piece. So what we're seeing here beginning in the 1420s and moving on is Titian very much interested in mythologies, mythological scenes, but also working increasingly for various courts in Italy. This will get in the way on a certain level with his work within Venice proper. He becomes really the most in-demand painter in all of Europe, particularly at European courts. This work for the various dukes in northern Italy brought him to the attention of their feudal overlord, Emperor Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had recently come into control of Italy, and all dukes in Italy were answerable to him as their overlord. He was visiting Italy in 1532, and Titian went to visit him. He visited him again on numerous other occasions. Never went to Spain, where Charles V kept his court, but saw him on numerous other occasions and painted him often, as well as members of his family. In return, Charles V gave Titian knighthood, made him a noble, including giving it retroactive to his ancestors, created him a lifelong noble simply for his talent as a painter. On the right, we see Charles V's son, Philip II of Spain, who will be a major patron of Titian's in the 1550s. Charles stepped down from the throne of the Holy Roman Emperor in 1556. The empire, which is Eastern Europe, passes to Charles' younger brother, Ferdinand, but the kingdoms of Spain and the territories of the Low Countries pass to Philip II. And so we see him here on the right, painted by Titian, still as a youth, not yet as King of Spain, which he would inherit in 1556. After becoming King of Spain, Philip initiates one of Titian's most important series of commissions, 6 or maybe 8 mythological pictures. Philip gives Titian entirely free rein, tells him he doesn't care what he paints, He doesn't even tell him where they're going to go. He doesn't have an idea. He just wants mythologies by Titian. Probably meant to rival the ones that Titian had done for the accounts of the Diction Ferrara. For the works, Titian turns to the Roman poet Ovid, the same source that Bellini had used for the Feast of the Gods, that Titian used for his allegories for the Alfonso d'Este in Ferrara. So again, I think there's a sense of rivalry between these new pictures and the old. And when he referred to these in his letters, Titian called them his painted poetries, his poesies in Italian. And he thinks in many ways he's also not only rivaling his earlier work, but also rivaling poetry as well. Now, while they're mythological scenes, we also need to remember that these works of art are probably intended as eroticized nudes, in keeping with the mythologies he does for other patrons. This was certainly the taste at courts throughout Europe in the 16th century. And to buttress this idea, to support it, the first work he does for Philip II is a variation on his earlier image of Danaia being seduced by Jupiter, where her nakedness is fully on display. Now, the story we're looking at on the left is all about looking at nudity. The story of Actaeon. Actaeon was a hunter. We see him on the far left. We see Phil behind him, his hunting dogs, and over his shoulder, his arrows. He's dropped his bow in amazement because while on the hunt, he has accidentally stumbled on Diana, the goddess of the hunt, who is busy bathing with all of her woodland nymphs, all of whom are virgins. Diana's maidens all show a range of reactions to Actaeon's accidental presence. Some of them quickly try to cover themselves up. Others seem a little coy and accepting. The woman behind the pillar has hid herself, but she looks out to see who this virile young man is. The other woman in front of the pillar looks as if she's not at all ashamed, but rather that she is rather welcoming of his gaze. Venus is with a servant who attempts to cover her up, so they're quickly bringing towels over the top of her so that Actaeon, the hunter, the human, does not see the nudity of the goddess, which is, of course, forbidden. Her little lapdog, the antithesis of Actaeon's big, virile hunting dog, but still alarming us to Actaeon's presence. Diana's gaze, however, suggests duality, if you will, of emotions. She's covering herself up because that's the proper thing to do, but at the same time she seems as if she's somewhat coy about it all, looking at him somewhat becomingly, almost a come-hither glance on her face. So it sort of sends mixed messages, if you will, about whether or not she likes this idea. Now, if you know the myth, it's kind of horrific, and the dog that's next to Actaeon is a harbinger of what will happen next, because Diana decides that she's outraged by all of this, even though it's a total accident, that she's outraged by Actaeon, and hasn't actually turned into a deer, and his own dogs attack him and rip him apart, and he's killed simply for accidentally seeing her here. So he's not really done anything wrong by volition. He's not tried to do anything wrong, but he's made a bad mistake. And it's always struck me as a bit of a harsh punishment on her part for somebody who just accidentally stumbled there. Another work from this series for Philip II, and probably these two were designed as a pair, is another image of Diana, another part of Diana's myth, with Callisto. And you'll notice that the stream runs in the foreground across the two of them. So they certainly were designed to be hung together, even though, again, Philip did not give Titian any kind of instructions on where these were going to be hung. That said, many of the pictures in the series seem to have been designed as pairs. So the story here is that Callisto, who we see on the opposite side of the screen being pointed to by Diana was one of these virginal maidens, right? These nymphs that attend Diana in the woods, Diana the huntress. And they had pledged to remain virgins as they were accompanying her in the woods. And of course, Jupiter, our god who loves human flesh, fell in love with Callisto and disguised himself as Diana to convince Callisto to sleep with him. So he goes to her in the guise of Diana and says, hey, you really need to sleep with Jupiter, it'll be okay. And, she says, well, Diana's telling me this, I guess it's all right, so she does. Of course, it was all a ruse. It was Jupiter just trying to find his way. 9 months later, Callisto's pregnant, and the real Diana gets suspicious. And after one of the hunts, you see the hunting dog in the foreground, the abandoned arrows in the lower right corner, right, another hunting dog there. After the hunt, Diana, suspicious, says to Callisto, take off your clothes, I want to see what's going on here. And lo and behold, she sees her being pregnant. So we have here the moment of revelation, the clothes being pulled apart, revealing Callisto's distended stomach, and Diana banishing her. In fact, at this point she's banished not only from the group, but Diana pulls another of these magic tricks and turns her into a bear, at which point she's actually almost killed by her own son, but survives that. So here's the moment of that change, if you will. Right? But again, it's all about viewing nudes, isn't it? The same thing we've seen before. In this case, Diana seeing one of her nymphs nude and discovering from that viewership. Another of these images, and again, I think it's all about viewing nudes, is Venus and Adonis. Again, all of these are from the series of Poesies, is mythological scenes for Philip II. Again, this is based on an earlier lost version from the 1540s. And then the one that was based on actually was intended to be a pendant to the Danaia painted for Farnese. So he had two pictures from Titian, Danaia and Venus and Adonis. And both of those serve as the basis for the new ones painted for Philip. So here is the one that he painted for Philip, the Danaia, and he wrote to Philip and said, I think that these two pictures should be looked at as a pair. He said, the first one I gave to you, the Danaia, was a nude scene from the front, and I painted this one in order to give you a nude scene from the back. So again, that idea of pairs, but also the idea of a rivalry between painting and sculpture, which is something that we've talked about on a number of different occasions. One of the things the sculptors said that was better about their art is that you could see the figure from both sides. Titian is suggesting that maybe he can do the same thing. Now the story here is that Cupid has afflicted Venus, and she's fallen in love with the beautiful hunter Adonis. We see Cupid in the background having hung up his bow and arrows, taking a little nap. The nap suggests that we're at the morning after a long, light night of lovemaking, and Adonis, at the crack of dawn, is about to go off on the hunt. Venus is trying to tell him that this is very dangerous, why don't you stay here with me? But he responds to the pull of his 3 dogs, and is going to go off on the hunt. It's actually this morning after that he's gored to death by a boar who is sent to kill him by Diana, who's jealous that this huntsman has fallen in love with Venus and spent the night with her. So he too is ravaged by animals, sent by the huntress Diana. And he eventually will die in Venus's arms, and she returns to heaven. There we see her returning to heaven in her chariot and forever sad at the death of Adonis. Now these images, these poesies, inspired many, many copies. And again, Titian and his studio cranked out numerous versions of these for different patrons. And we're lucky to have one of them in the National Gallery. there were two types of copies that were done by Titian, especially of this particular images. Some of them repeat Philip's version with the sleeping cupids, with 3 dogs, and with the light in the sky coming from Venus's chariot. The others, like ours, are after the original version he had painted to go with the Danaia for Cardinal Farnese. And this original version had only 2 dogs. Cupid, in the background, is holding on to a dove. Someone asked what kind of bird that is. It's definitely a dove, one of Cupid's symbols, a standard symbol for Cupid. And the original version, rather than Philip's, reflected in our copy, also had no chariot in the sky. Now, the studio is definitely involved with this. As we look at this whole group of Venus and Adonis pictures, there's a good half dozen to a dozen of them from Titian's shop. They exhibit quite a range of quality. And we had looked at the dog, for example, and had mentioned the fact that its head was a little small and ill-placed, the back leg a little on the large side. This suggests that Titian's studio did indeed have something to do with it. Now, what Titian did was to keep sketches after all of his compositions in his studio. Sometimes they were painted sketches, sometimes drawn sketches, and these formed the basis for copies that were being cranked out of the studio so that he could supply this burgeoning market for works by Titian. Our last mythology by Titian has nothing to do with Philip II, but relates to this idea of copying and the practice of copying that his studio was doing in the 1550s onward. Venus caught at her toilet bathing, looking into a mirror held up by Cupid, being crowned for her beauty. Certainly, our looking at her in the toilet, in her boudoir, fits into this new taste for mythological nudes that really began with well, it was really always there, but began in earnest again with the Venus of Urbino. But Titian had always been doing these sorts of things, and they really go ways back, right? We've seen it, the woman with the mirror, for example, from your textbook, as a similar version to this, a little bit more upstanding. She's brushing her hair, she has perfume, she's not naked for us to look at. But if we go back and look at Bellini's version, that seems to form the basis for all of this. We certainly see the long-standing interest in these eroticized women in Venetian painting. So to wrap this up, this is something that Titian had been doing all along, these eroticized nudes. At the same time, from the late 1530s, around 1540 onward, there seems to have been a broader interest in these works, primarily from Titian's shop, but certainly coming from the patrons of the different courts that are employing him. Our work, our Venus with the Mirror, was in fact the work that he kept in his studio, and any copies that were made after this original that seems to have stayed in Titian's shop all the way till his death.